Welcome everybody tonight. I want to thank you very much for coming and for tuning in with us to be a part of this evening, to see, that's okay, to listen and hear what we have decided for this year, or our not really, I guess not full decisions, but or how what we've come up with so far. I'd like to introduce my fellow trustees who are here today. I have Dana Bardo, I have Ashley Chamberlain, Patsy Chahai, Debbie Lee, and Lisa Mahoybuk. I botch it every time, I'm sorry. Thank you guys for all coming here and being here to support Stephen and Darrell. Stephen, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Good evening, everyone. How many people we have tuning in at home now, Jay? All right, so we're up to 14 at home. So my name's Stephen David. If you don't know me, I'm the superintendent. Myself and Darrell Fulton, the secretary-treasurer, will be leading you through our draft budget for 2019-2020. What I will say is if you have a question at any time, just raise your hand. You don't have to wait till the end to ask a question. And what I'll do, just because we have a mic that's recording for archival purposes, but also for the people that are viewing online, I'll just ask your question again and try to answer it, or Darrell will do the same. So feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. Just to preface this a little bit, and I'll speak to it throughout the presentation, this was another challenging budget, certainly. As you know, there's been now 3 years with restrictions on taxation, 2 years with a restriction on taxation, 3 consecutive years of funding decreases. It's been increasingly difficult and challenging. I can tell you, though, despite some decisions about important programs and positions and services, we feel that we're close to being the best possible scenario that we could be for next year. And we're open to hearing from you, the public, whether you're listening online or for people that might view this later. The process, which I'll outline, we do not have to have the official budget into the province till March 31st. So it happens pretty quickly, but we still have some time for consideration. Next Thursday night is a board meeting. We're going to open it up for any public presentations. You'll recall last year there's quite a few, and we had them at the elementary school. And tentatively, we have March 7th scheduled for the approval of the budget, but we don't have to do it then if we're not ready to approve it. So what I'll do is I'll flip through some slides. I'll try not to read them word for word because I'm sure you can all read. I'll try to provide some highlights, and then about midway through, I'll hand it over to our secretary-treasurer that will lead you through some of the financial information. So this is a good way to start because whether or not people agree with the perspective, the business of education is students, and the more students you have, typically the higher your funding goes. Unless there's a funding guarantee or a formula guarantee or a funding restriction. So if you look over the last 12 or 13 years, we're actually at one of our highest enrollments in that time period. The only time that exceeded our projected enrollment for next year is 2015, 2016. It was essentially the same. Park West is a little bit unique in terms of the school divisions in Manitoba. There's a few similar to us, but 27.3% of our students are First Nations as of the September 30th enrollment count, which is very significant. At any given time, we're first or second or third in the province in terms of the percentage of First Nation students. Frontier School Division, which spans most of Manitoba, is the first in that regard, but we're often first or second or third. And that breaks down how we get our funding. So for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to focus on the funding that we get on the provincial side. So we have a partnership with Wayo-Escapo First Nation, which comprises about $6 million of our total $30 million budget. But in terms of what I want to speak to tonight, I'll be focusing on the provincial side, both the funding that we get from the province, as well as the funding that we get from the local levy, the local taxation. Part of the reason for speaking it from this perspective is the nature of our partnership with Wayo-Escapo First Nation. The funding that they receive for their school on reserve stays on reserve for their budgeting purposes. So I'll speak to the pressures, challenges, and plans for the provincial side, essentially the 14 other schools. So here are the challenges this past year and this coming year. It's great to have an increased enrollment, but because of a cap, a limit on school funding, even though we go up by almost 40 students for next year, we're still getting reduced by 2%. And that's the third consecutive year where we have that 2%. We also have a limit on local taxation. It's the second year that that's the case, and we can only go up to 2% local taxation. For all intents and purposes, in the last 2 years, that limit on local taxation doesn't even cover the reduction in funding that we get because of the decrease. We also have decreased revenue from First Nations. High school students for Wavis-Capo and 2 other First Nations come to our schools, and we're funded for them. And unlike the provincial side, if there's fluctuations in provincial funding or provincial enrollment, our budget doesn't change. But every student that goes up or down on the federal side affects our budget. So in the last 2 years, we've been quite good over a 10-year period. But in the last 2 years, we've had some unique circumstances whereby the numbers of students that we projected on the First Nation side weren't realized, and that has a direct impact on our budget. For example, next year, we're looking at about $150,000 decreased funding. I think that's the number, but I'll confirm it later, just because of decreased enrollment on the First Nation side. Increased costs related to staffing. So if anyone read anything about the provincial budget announcement or watched it on television or online, the education minister spoke to how with the Bill 28 salary freeze for provincial or public servants, that school divisions would be much better off and it would be much easier for them to budget. That is not the case for most school divisions. So we have significant increases that are required, that are built in just by the nature of what we do. So most school divisions, or all school divisions, would have similar challenges. And because it's a service profession and a service industry, about 80% of our costs are staffing related. So in terms of our costs for next year, about 1/3 of our staff are in the first 10 years of their employment. So they get increments, as do many professions. I've said it this way a couple times, and I'll say it the same way. We're also setting records with maternity leaves for staff members in the last 2 years. Very significant. So I think over the last 2 years, doubling would be a fair estimate. So this current year and last year, maybe last year we budgeted $225,000 to cover maternity leave. We went way beyond that last year, and we're tracking to go well beyond that again next year. Operating surplus and capital funds decrease. So a lot of school divisions have varying degrees, or school divisions have varying degrees of surpluses. A lot of accountants and financial people would recommend organizations such as a school division should have about a 4% surplus. We're nowhere near that. We're actually likely in the 0.5 to 1% depending on the way we look at our numbers, whether it's the provincial side alone or the provincial side in combination with the partnership with Wayway. And the reasons for that are varied. I can tell you that some of it relates to the lack of realization of our First Nation numbers over the last couple of years. We've applied large portions of our surplus in previous budgets to lower the local taxation, and we've had some unexpected things that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years that lead us to a point that we almost have no surplus. So we don't have that. We can't draw upon that. And finally, maintaining rate infrastructure, which I'll speak to later. And it's not my intent to speak so much to every slide. This is just an important one to frame the conversation today. So I've already mentioned these things. If anyone was following the news, Winnipeg School Division last Monday was on the front page of the Free Press, and they were exploring, the article said, going up to 2.9% for local taxation. Then on Thursday morning, I received a letter from the Minister of Education addressed to me directly and handwritten, his signature at the end, and I assume he sent them to 37 school divisions, and it was a reminder that the cap on taxation was a directive. It wasn't a suggestion. So last year, there was about 5 or 6 divisions that contemplated going beyond 2%. No division went beyond 2%. And there'll be, I would suggest that there would be none this year. So when you put all of these things together, it makes for a challenging starting place to start talking about budgeting. I feel for our new trustees that just started their term in November because they come in for their first budget, and it's a budget where we have to find enough reductions in expenditures to cover necessary increases. I've been fortunate to be around the board table, I think now for 10 years. And in previous years, we would talk about what programs we want to offer or what new things we want to bring to the division. While there's still room for addition in our current budget, it's quite limited. The other big challenge is now with the third year of challenging budgeting. I've used the analogy about an onion. And in the first 2 years, we have been removing the peeling on the onion and the layers. We're getting close to the core. And the best way I can explain it to you, the core for this board and the previous board is maintaining services, staffing, and programs at a school level. So that was our priority as best we could to limit any cuts that would directly impact our schools. Unfortunately, in order to do that, we have to look at division-wide programs, services, and staffing to address that. So the net change in our overall budget from one year to the other is $178,000 to the negative, and that's a 0.7% reduction. But because there were so many things that we had to cover, so many other required expenditures, the net reduction that we had to look for in this current budget was $693,000. And I'm going to jump ahead. Last year, one of the things we introduced was the potential for vocational programs, the high school programs, to be cut. And it was a big ticket item last year, and it's a big ticket item again this year. And there was lots of public concern and public presentation, and many of our high school students gave perspective about the value of those programs. And we agreed completely. It was a difficult thing to even contemplate last year. It was less of an option this year because each year and over the last 3 weeks, we kept removing things, and nothing's been put back. And the list of what we can remove this year has grown quite slim. In fact, we're already thinking ahead and trying to anticipate what next year might look like. And I don't want to get into speaking about the education review, and part of the reason it probably will not have a lot of relevance in our budget next year is they're suggesting that they will be done the review by February 2020 with a public report in March. Our budget will likely be done already unless they tell us don't turn your budget in until the review ends. So in anticipating another 2% next year, if that has been the trend for the last 3 years, it would be almost unavoidable for us to start looking at school-based staffing, but that isn't the case this year. Infrastructure spending. Our transportation supervisor does an excellent job telling us about the need for us to get a sustainable plan for replacing school buses. Unfortunately, the financial challenges of the last 3 years has put our plan out of whack. So for a 10 or 11 year period from 2005 to 2015, we're replacing about 2 buses a year on average. And in the previous 3 years, we've only replaced 2 buses. So in presenting to us, as all our department heads have the option, our Secretary-Treasurer suggested that we need a minimum of 2 buses next year, but up to 4, try to get us back on the replacement plan. But when we've met several times over the last month, Division Admin and Board, and when we looked at what else we would have to cut to get a second bus, as you'll see later, we've only put a single bus in. But again, you're going to see what we're talking about for next year, and many of you would have looked at the one-pager that we sent out on Tuesday to kind of give you a heads up to what we're talking about. And there's been lots of increasing needs in our maintenance department, and while there have been increases in the budget, they haven't really been at the level that we likely will need. And a lot of it is just repair maintenance rather than preventative maintenance. And I'm not suggesting our buildings are falling apart. Our buildings are in fantastic shape, and our custodians and maintenance staff do an excellent job in maintaining them. But instead of being able to ask for additional funds to support positions or maintenance work or transportation-related things, we're asking our department heads to find ways to reduce their budgets just so we can meet the provincial requirement and limit on taxation. So this is just a simple graph that shows you from 2012-13 to next year's proposed budget. The green is the amount of money that is spent on staffing, and the blue is essentially infrastructure, maintenance, transportation, things that aren't related to staffing. So if you look in the first year, 16.1 million was staffing, 5.8 was infrastructure. Look how dramatically the staffing line has increased. And that's not people getting significant wages. There was one collective agreement within there where there were increments, but it's what I've explained before about people in the first 10 years getting salary increments, maternity leaves, things of that nature. Because what you'll see in the bottom, there's 280 FTEs in our proposed budget. There was actually 2 more staff in our division at the beginning of that 2012-2013 continuum. So our wages have gone up despite the fact that we reduced staff by 2. And that's just the inflationary cost of staffing. And I feel a little bit bad looking at Rebecca taking notes, because Rebecca presented a couple of years ago very passionately to the board about Career Trek. The starting point this year is the things that we removed in the previous 2 years, we didn't even consider putting them back for all intents and purposes. We had some discussion about things like middle years vocational and some other things, but the dilemma or the challenge that we had is every time we looked to put something back in, we had to find something to take out to offset it. So last year, the debate was middle years vocational and some other things versus high school vocational. This year, middle years vocational was already gone from the previous year. This year, it was high school vocational against school-based staffing. That's where the discussion went this year, and that was the challenge. So I'm not going to read these, but I think you're well aware of the things, the programs, the services, the positions that we've cut over the last 2 years and now coming to the next year. And what I can tell you is, and we have a couple of former trustees that are joining us tonight that were part of our previous board. None of those cuts in the first year were easy. Everything that we've cut or reduced in the previous 2 years and what we're suggesting for next year were important program services and staff members in our division. None of them were extras, none of them were fluff, none of them were things that we didn't deem important. There were things that a lot of people in the division, students and staff, developed and put a lot of time into sustaining and growing. I mean, we cut a grade 6 career or a grade 6 outdoor education program that we won a national award for from Parks Canada. Those things are tough to consider. But again, our basic starting point is let's limit the impact on our schools and students in the classroom. Yeah. I'm not going to read them because you can read them yourself, but I also don't want to read them because I've revisited them so many times in the last couple of years. And I'm not trying to be melodramatic. A lot of these things, all of these things are very important to the school division and very important to students and staff. This presentation will be posted tomorrow online, and our helper, our ICT man to my right, Jason Kelly, who I should acknowledge now so I don't forget, he's live streaming this, and he's going to also edit the recording and put it online. So I suspect by tomorrow you'll be able to look at the PowerPoint if you're interested, and probably by Monday you'll be able to watch this if anyone would want to do that again. I'm not sure. Perhaps some people will miss it. I'll send it to my mom in Nova Scotia. Maybe she would want to watch it. I doubt it, though. So I talked about this already. Not really much more to say. There were many years from 2005, 2006 where the board chose to use significant portions of surplus to minimize the impact on taxpayers. Back to the days of Mad Cow 12, 14 years ago to some other times where we wanted to limit taxation. The end result, unfortunately, there were so many rainy days, we don't have that rainy day fund to draw upon. So one of the things we have to budget for next year is to start building up our surplus again. So here are the proposed changes for next year. There's $327,000 of increased costs related to salary. So that's maternity leave, increments. What's the third one, Darrell, that I always forget? Oh, yeah. So we have 40 more students in the school division. We likely could have added up to 2.5 teachers using the different formulas and ratios. We only added 0.8 of a teacher. The reason for that is because of the pressure of our current fiscal reality. So myself and the Assistant Superintendent, John Zilke, over in the end, you can wave, John, for the people that are here, The second week in January each year, we meet with individual principals for about an hour each at the division office, and we look at what they're proposing for their school-based staffing, and then we decide what the number is going to be. And we have a good conversation about what each school needs to do to meet the needs of the students and deliver the program that they want. There were multiple instances this year where we told principals, you could get up to an extra 0.75 teacher this year based upon your increase in enrollment. You're getting a 0.25 increase. Or you can get a half more teacher typically because of your enrollment increase. We know you can staff it where you are currently, and because of our budget pressure, you will not be getting an increase in staff. So we do have schools that are increasing enrollment and some that fluctuate up and down at any given time. But instead of adding 2.5 teachers to the system because of our 40 new students, we're only adding 0.8 of a teacher. One school bus, which I've mentioned already, interest costs, every time the Bank of Canada rate goes up, our costs go up. Transportation operating costs, a lot of these are fixed things because of repairs and maintenance going up, fuel cost changes. We had an unfortunate circumstance that I think it's worth pointing out where 4 of our newest school buses were from a group of school buses made by a particular manufacturer that have had multiple mechanical problems. 2 of the 4 school buses in our division that are relatively new have already had engine replacements. So a lot of those costs are fixed. In fact, transportation's the only budget really in our entire division where there's an increase, and it's because it's an unavoidable increase. It's required increases just to maintain our existing infrastructure and transportation. School of choice fees to other divisions, that just fluctuates back and forth. We have kids that come from other divisions to our division. We have kids that go to other divisions. The main ones for us are students from Park West to go to DSFM and Saint-Lazare, kids that live along the border that might go to school in Churchbridge or Langenburg, and then we have some kids that go program not offered, whereby they might go to Crocus or somewhere else for culinary arts or something that we don't offer. And that's not an increase. It's just we need to budget to more accurately because the numbers have changed a little bit. It's not that we have a big spike in that. We just want to make sure the budget accurately reflects the expenditure in that area. And this decrease in ICT budget, I spoke to this last year, but it was a long time ago. Essentially, we gave the ICT department an infrastructure loan because we needed a bunch of wireless upgrades to be able to meet the capacity of our new fiber network. But the requirement was over a 3-year period, this year, next year, and the following year, that they will repay that loan. So that's what that loan is referencing there. And then here are the reductions. So the first one we looked at, just because it was such a big ticket item, was middle or high school vocational. And just to be clear, that's the 4 programs that run divisionally that aren't tied to a specific school but are housed in 2 of our schools. The healthcare aid program that runs in conjunction with ACC, nature studies program that runs here, a construction program that runs here, and a cosmetology program that's housed at Wayway N-8. So the total cost of those programs for staffing, transportation, and supplies is over $300,000. We talked about multiple models and other options. We looked at the possibility of alternating 2 programs each year, back and forth, to sustain them and keep them running. We would still need another $200,000 out of our budget from some other area to make that a possibility. And while we have tremendous value in those programs, the other thing we said last year when we reinstated them in our current budget is we would recruit hard to try to get the enrollment up. We wouldn't do anything to transportation to prevent any barriers from students attending. And we just have not realized the enrollment that we had hoped. So they're extremely high-cost programs. We're not arguing about the value of them. Although we did hear from a lot of people, I should mention, last year when we put them back in. I'm not exaggerating. There would have been 15 to 20 people that phoned me or emailed me, staff and community members, that said you shouldn't have taken the middle years programs out for these. So there's always different perspectives on things. And a loud voice that we didn't hear till after the final budget was people that were telling us we should focus on K to 12 and not post-secondary, as many people saw those 4 programs. We had no choice but to look at it this year. So really quickly, I can tell you that in those 4 programs last year, we had 42 students enrolled. That enrollment went down to 32 this year. We were averaging probably 15 to 20 in healthcare aid in the first 4 years of the program's existence. We currently have 7 people in the program. We contemplated even not having them run second semester, because all of them, they're averaging about 8 or 9 per course. But we were committed to the program this year and to the students, so we didn't want to do anything to them. But that's why they're as a proposed cut. Restructured divisional administration. My colleague, Mr. Zilke over there, congratulations, has just accepted a superintendency at Swan Valley School Division. And because of the depth of the cuts that were required, the division and the board wanted to lead from the top. And there was lots of questions last year about whether we need two superintendents, and we have a Q&A document that speaks to that. We're phasing out the assistant superintendent position. So the responsibilities that Mr. Zilke currently has will be assigned to a couple of different positions as best we can do. And then the net potential saving in that area is $128,000, which is significant, but even putting the first 2 together, we're barely halfway to, or just over halfway where we need to get to. We also have 1.5 curriculum positions in our division currently. We're reducing that to a single position. The half-time will be phased out next year in our proposed budget. Student services budget is reducing by 50. Essentially, our student service coordinator looked at her budget, and we told her we needed that amount from her budget, and she reduced some EA time. Up until this point, and currently, she gets 10 hours of flex time. It's essentially 2 EA positions extra a year, and she can use that to respond to any unexpected student needs over the course of the school year. That's been reduced in half, and she's also reduced other areas in her budget. Maintenance budget's been reduced by $35,000. There's a budgeted spot for a half a painter that we didn't fill this year, but we're removing it completely from the budget for next year. So the maintenance will be done by our maintenance staff, or the painting, I should say, not by our maintenance staff, or not by a painter. Extracurricular trips, 2 years ago, we had a $100,000 budget divisionally to supplement school trips for field trips and sports and things of that nature. Last year, we took $25,000 out of that budget to drop it to $75,000. In next year's draft budget, we're proposing another $26,000 reduction. And distributed learning, it's basically a new term that we're using to describe online learning. Currently, we have a half a divisional position that is allocated to online learning. We're reducing that by a quarter, but we're also doing something different with online learning next year. And I've used the phrase that sometimes scarcity makes you or helps you to be innovative. Because of a reduction in staffing, we're looking at new ways to deliver programs. We're also monitoring student enrollment. And a lot of our high school math courses, especially pre-calculus and applied math in our 5 small schools, not counting Major Pratt, have very low enrollments. Several schools with fewer than 10 students. We have a proposed plan that we're working on with teachers and with principals right now that will be innovative in that every student in every one of our high schools will have access to every single math program or math course in high school. The flip side, though, is not all of them are going to be delivered on site. So all schools will deliver math on a rotational basis, a multi-year rotation, but in any given year, your school, if you're one of the 5 small high schools, may not be delivering grade 12 pre-calculus. Your students may be connecting online. And we're piloting a couple of new models of online delivery this semester just to kind of work out the kinks and to get ready for that. This isn't a reduction to the photocopier budget, this is remove the photocopier budget. So we cut it in half last year. We have $20,000 in the photocopy replacement budget. We're eliminating that completely. So instead of having a 5-year rotation for replacing photocopiers, which is generally the industry standard in school divisions, we're just going to replace as needed. And hopefully none of them are needed replacement next year. But again, some of these things are deep cuts and pretty harsh, and I can tell you that we're removing a lot of the buffer, for lack of a better way to describe it. So if we have the misfortune of 3 photocopiers going down next year, we're going to be scrambling in a bit to take it from other budgets to make sure that it doesn't drain whatever money we're putting into the surplus. Reductions to Decker Mono Colony schools and resources, just adjusting some staffing allocations and some things that are done in both colonies. Very specifically for Decker Colony, we're proposing in the draft budget that we reduce a rental payment that we pay Decker Colony. And for Monarch Colony, they have 3 or 4 high school students, 4 next year I think, that take high school courses online from their parent colony. We're going to make them pay for those courses themselves out of their staffing. Some of these reductions are pretty minor when you look at $693,000, but we were doing everything we could, take a little bit from as many different locations, with the exception of a couple of the big ones, the vocational programs and the assistant superintendent positions, just to get to the $693,000 that we needed and to avoid any necessity to cut school-based staffing. Reduction in division office supplies, $10,000. We're still going to put money into our surplus because we need to build up our surplus, but we're going to put $85,000 into our surplus and not the $93,000 that we put in this year. And this was a tough one. For many years, we've given a $1,000 grant to our 2 regional festivals. We gave them a heads up earlier in the year that with tough budgets, we were going to be focusing on our K-12 mandate, and we told both of them, both of the festivals, that we would take the $1,000 grant away. It wasn't intentional. Yeah, the trustee remuneration, and it's back to the point that I made earlier regarding the assistant superintendent position. The cuts in our division have to be division-wide. Like there was a position eliminated last year. It was in the division office. Granted, it was only a half-time position, but that person lost their job. And if we're going to be cutting division-wide, we need to cut in the division office too, and that includes the trustees. So 2 things we're proposing for the trustees. To their credit, they took leadership with this. They're cutting their remuneration, their honorarium for being a trustee, by 20%, and they're also reducing their meetings to reduce costs associated with travel and meeting time and things of that nature. So we currently have 2 regular meetings a month. We're proposing 1 regular meeting in a month. There's still other special meetings. I mean, in the last month and a half, we've been meeting every week, mainly because of budget, interspersed with their regular meetings. But next year, they're going to reduce their meetings as well as their honorarium or their remuneration to help find us other areas to save. And that was not intentional, to overlook that. This is pretty significant. Even though we have almost 40 new students, 38 new students, we're almost reducing 4.5 positions in our division. Now, many of these positions are people that have permanent status. For example, in this building, the teacher that teaches nature studies is half-time divisional nature studies, half-time in this building. But when he returns to full-time in this building, it has a trickle-down effect. The net change in this building, because they house a couple of vocational programs, is they need 1 teacher at the bottom end of seniority potentially to be reassigned. But there are some positions that are not being replaced. The curriculum position, for example. The person that filled it this year was on term. It's not going to be an option for that person or anyone in the division next year. We're not replacing the assistant superintendent. The painter position, which we didn't fill this year anyway, we're not going to have in the budget for next year. A fewer educational assistants. And that's about it with that one, I think. This is where you take over, Drill? Excellent. Any questions of any of that stuff before I move on? All right, for anyone at home, this is Dorel Fulton. She's the secretary treasurer from the school division. She's going to lead you through the financial information on the next few slides.
Okay, hi, everybody. So, am I okay here, Jason? Where should I stand? Okay. Yeah, I need to look at the slides quite a bit for my part. So this first slide breaks down our proposed 2019-20 budget. The slide on the left is expenditures by function. So it shows that we spend almost 60% on regular instruction. So those are classroom, teachers, and principals in the schools. We spend about 13% on student support services. So that would be educational assistants, resource teachers, guidance counselors. We spend about 4% on divisional administration. It's actually 3.5, but it rounds up to 4 for this chart. We spend 2% on curriculum, librarians and library resources and professional development, 8% on transportation, 11% on maintenance, and 3% on payroll tax, interest, capital items, that's our one school bus, and the $85,000 going into our operating reserves. The chart on the right is expenditures by object, so it's the same amount, the same roughly 24 million, just being broken down in a different way to show that we spend 78% of our budget on salaries and benefits, 19% on services and supplies, and then there's that same 3% from the first pie chart. So whereas the last chart was just the 2019-20 budget, this table shows the change in expenditures by object comparing this year's proposed budget to last year's budget, which is our current year, 2018-19. So salaries at the top there, our greatest area of spending. The net effect of the changes Stephen talked about, so 4.35 positions being removed or reduced, offset by the increased costs of increments like Stephen mentioned, and also maternity and parental benefit leaves. The net effect of that is $135,000 reduction in salary expense in 2019-20. Benefits are going up a little bit, $20,000. That reflects the CPP rate increase as well as a change in the non-teaching staff pensions. There's a change in the way that's being calculated. That was based on Manitoba School Boards Association rule that everyone contributes 8%. Previously, it was based on your age. So there was a difference depending on your age, and it was decided that that was discriminatory on the basis of age. So now everyone pays a straight 8%, and that has an effect. It's going to cost us some more money next year. Services are going down roughly 200,000. A large part of that is bus contractors. More of our bus routes will be fleet or managed by our own school buses. Fiscal, the 50,000 there, that's increased interest cost. As Stephen mentioned, the Bank of Canada interest rates have been going up, and we have to reflect that in our budget. And then the change in capital items. So the 200,000 this year, that's 115 for the bus, 85,000 for operating reserves, whereas last year's 113,000 was broke down 93,000 for operating reserves and $20,000 for photocopiers. So there's the change in our total expenditures, 178,000 to match the change in our total revenues. Oops. Here again, just more detail for you if you want to see it by function instead of by object. Some of the big changes you'll see in divisional admin, we're going to be down 91,000 compared to 2018-19, or 10%. That's largely due to the removal of the assistant superintendent position. Part of that position is coded to curriculum, because that is a role of that position, the leader of our curriculum. And the other factor in that $109,000 decrease to curriculum is the removal of the 0.5 literacy numeracy facilitator. There we go, revenues by source. So this table shows the 178,000 that we're losing in revenue, broken down by revenue type this year versus next year. So as Stephen mentioned, we're losing 2% from the province. Municipal, on this slide it's showing as 3%. I can explain the difference later. It's mostly just a difference in the way and terminology. I'll get into the difference between special requirement and special levy in another slide. Our First Nations revenue is expected to drop by 7%, or about $147,000. It's actually 167 when you add the revenue from Wayway that we get from them for shared costs. So that's going down to about 385,000 from 405,000. So Wayway pays for about 19% of positions like Stephen's, John's, mine, the trustees as well. Also for student services, maintenance, and ICT. So costs that we share. And then the chart at the bottom just shows just a pie chart breaking down where we get our revenue. So now I'll get into the details a little bit of the difference between the special requirement and the special levy. Really the difference is just the year that we're talking about. So when we're talking about the calendar year, which is the way municipalities raise taxes or collect taxes from their taxpayers, in that case we talk about a special levy, but school divisions talk about a special requirement. So that's what the school division needs to collect from its taxpayers based on its fiscal year, which runs July 1st to June 30th. And this is what has been limited to a 2% increase, the special requirement, not the levy. This year, the change in the levy amounts to 1.9%. The reason the slide before mentioned 3% is because when we're talking about the special requirement and the special levy, we're including the education property tax credit, which is levied on taxpayers, but paid by the province. A good chunk of it, I should say. The $700 per household is paid by the province. So here's just an explanation is how I go from the municipal funding shown in the previous slide to the special requirement. That's the part that's been capped at 2% for us by the province. And then this chart, again, just shows how we get from the special requirement to the special levy. So we take 56% of the 2018-19 special requirement, add that to 44% of the 2019-20 special requirement, add those together, and that gives us our calendar year 2019 special levy for Park West School Division. The reason I specify for Park West is then we need to collect additional taxes because we have St. Lazare operating within the Park West boundary. So we need to collect another $318,000 for that in 2019. And we reduce it by the tax incentive grant to get the total special levy, which is increasing by 1.9%. So I guess that's the take-home message, is that taxes for Park West School Division residents will be increasing by roughly 2% overall. Now that will change based on the type of property that you own and the assessed value of your property. So I include these next few slides more as a resource if you want to go online and figure out what your taxes or what the change in school taxes will mean for your personal property taxes. The odd years are not reassessment years, so we don't see large increases in odd years. It's the even years where we get the reassessment notices from the government. So this year, just an overall increase of 0.7. Some people ask me about the mill rate. Not a big change in the mill rate in 2019, just going up from 10.4 to 10.5. If you want to know how the mill rate's calculated, then it's just the special levy divided by the total assessed value of all property within Park West School Division. And you take that result and multiply it by 1,000. Special levy by property type. So of the 10 million that we'll be raising from taxpayers in Park West School Division, about half of that, 4.9 million, is going to come from farm landowners. About 3 million will come from residential landowners property owners, and the remaining 2 million will come from businesses, other commercial property owners. Here I run through some examples to show exactly how your taxes are calculated. I won't go through that line by line, but please feel free to use this as a resource. It'll be posted online tomorrow, as Stephen mentioned. Maybe I'll just note the $700 rebate applies to residential property owners. Farmland owners are eligible for up to a $5,000 rebate. It's 80% of the taxes they pay, but up to a maximum of $5,000. And unfortunately, there's no rebate for commercial businesses. This is a slide we always put in just for reference to show the history of the special levy within Park West School Division. So at the bottom there, 2019, that's the 1.9 we've talked about. You can see that's about the lowest it's been. There's a couple years of 1.5 and a 0% increase back in 2009. Stephen, did you want to talk about next steps?
So you may have heard when I was walking down, I just asked Jason how many people are viewing online. So we get up to 30 or 30 currently. Oh, fantastic. So I think I spoke to a bit of this at the beginning, but the one thing I want to mention is we learned some lessons. Each year we learn lessons, and one of the things that we made a priority this year was to involve stakeholders more and get their feedback. So a couple of things that we did that aren't mentioned on this slide. In 2 communities, 2 regional areas of our school division, in Russell and Show Lake, we had evenings in December for pre-budget meetings to hear from public about potential things that we might focus on. I think in Russell we had about 25 or 26 people, including the trustees and divisional administration. Then on a colder night, 2 nights later in Show Lake, we only had 1 person, unfortunately. And we just kind of give that person a Coles Notes version of the previous evening. We also had a stakeholder survey that many of you may have seen. It ran the last week in November, first week in December. We had over 1,100 respondents, of which the majority were students. There was about 150 staff members responded, and 125, 103 parents. And it's noteworthy because it was just posted, I think, a Monday on our divisional website. So there's a summary of the feedback that we collected from our stakeholders. They speak to some broad general priorities. They talk about things that make their school experience better, but we also asked them a question about what things should be our financial priorities. And their perspective was things that we considered when we were talking around the board table and as divisional administration about things that we might look at. And also, you may notice the absence of municipal government people tonight, and it may relate to the fact that it was only last week that we met with them. So last Wednesday, upstairs in this building, or 2 weeks ago, yeah, it seemed like 2 weeks ago, we met with about 30 or so, maybe more, closer to 40, I think, government officials from municipal governments. So town or municipality, councilors, reeves, heads of council, mayors, and they came to give us their perspective and ask some questions, and they give us further things to think about. So going forward, one thing that a mistake we made maybe 2 or 3 years ago is we had this meeting on a Tuesday, and then we invited people to come back 2 days later to make presentations to the board. We didn't do that last year. This time you have a week. We want people to have time to think about what we're suggesting and what we're proposing, to ask us questions. What I can tell you, and I'll remind you if you're not aware of it already, on our financial page on our division website, we have a Q&A document from last year that we're going to add to this year as we have questions coming in. So people ask questions like, why do we need 2 superintendents? So last year we explained the difference in the roles. Last year someone asked a question, which I'll answer right now because the question came up with the municipalities. Why don't we reduce the number of trustees? We actually looked into the possibility of reducing trustees right now. And we were quite certain the answer, but they clarified it. You cannot reduce trustees until an election. So you could have a position that becomes vacant within 6 months of an election that you don't have to replace or something in that range, but we could not say we're only having 5 trustees starting in June. So it's definitely something the board will be looking at, and they even talked about committing to that sometime early in this mandate just to know that that's coming with the next election. There's lots of arguments for and against, and I find my eyes averting from our 2 retired trustees because it's good to have local representation, and with the review coming up, that's the theme of school boards across Canada, or across Manitoba, I should say. Local voices, local choices. But we're trying to lead from the top, given the depth of the reductions that were required. The big thing I will say is, despite some serious programs and services and staffing reductions, we are sustaining everything at a K-12 level. And I don't want to speculate about next year, but hopefully we don't have the same budget circumstance from the province, because then we'll be looking at those programs. There's not much left extra in terms of divisional positions or programs that we could look at as a starting point. And that's assuming that what we're suggesting here in the proposed budget goes forward. Last year, and it's not intended to be pessimistic, but last year when we got the feedback from students and community members and parents about vocational programs, we had many hours of discussion about whether or not to keep it in the proposed cuts or to return it. And ultimately, we decided to bring it back for another year to see if we could boost enrollment and make it more cost-effective. This year, I don't even know if we have that luxury. And what I can tell you is, if we pull that out, we're then looking at reductions in divisors to every school and their staffing. So the alternative to vocational programs are things like getting rid of our additional support for kindergarten. In our division, we have 0.75 kindergarten positions. They go half-time first term, full-time second term. Province only funds at half-time. But it's not as simple as removing that staffing because we have many small schools that have combined kindergarten classes. So they still need a full-time person to cover the grade ones that are there and the kindergartens aren't there. Those types of things would be pretty significant. And I'm going to be very candid. Because of what we required this year, we talked about things like high school band programs and elementary music programs just because we needed so much savings to make this budget work for next year. But again, I feel good because one of the things we committed to when we made a tenet at the beginning of the process when we started talking about before Christmas was minimizing the impact on our schools. Now, you certainly can make an argument that it impacts our schools if our high school kids lose the opportunity to go to these special vocational programs. It was just the unfortunate reality of what we're faced with. It's either that or we change the staffing at schools. And that was what it came down to. March 7th is the tentative date to approve the budget because that's our only regular meeting date in March. But if we need to go further, we'll have a special meeting and schedule it somewhere else. And then the other two dates are the required dates. By the 15th, we have to tell municipal governments what the level of taxation will be. We're pretty sure it's going to be around 2%, because that's as far as we can go. And then by the end of March, March 29th, we have to have our detailed line-by-line budget into the province. And that was a lot of talking, but there was lots of information. Any questions? Any comments? If you want to make a comment, and it's more than a simple question, I'll hand the mic over to you, and feel free to give your perspective. The camera is here. We could adjust it to get the crowd. If it's a single question that we're able to address, just for the benefit of the people viewing online, I may read it or paraphrase it for you and then try to answer it or have one of my colleagues answer. So any questions or comments? Okay, so one of our online viewers asked, why not exceed 2%? I'll just reiterate the point I made at the beginning. A quick anecdote. Winnipeg School Division last Monday suggested, and it was in the Free Press, that they would go to 2.9. 2 days later or 3 days later, all school divisions received letters from the minister. Dear Steve and Dave, it was our letter, and signed by pen by the Minister of Education at the end. And just a reminder that this is a directive. It's not a suggestion. So we don't have that luxury. We can't exceed it. We could, but I can tell you that through the back channels, talking to other superintendents and other secretary-treasurers last year, there were the 4 or 5 divisions that contemplated, and I can't even recall which divisions that were thinking about it last year, but in no uncertain terms, they were told, if you increase your taxation, we'll decrease your provincial funding, so the net effect is the same. If you're supposed to decrease in funding by 2%, that's what you'll be decreasing in funding for next year. So that's what we can't do it because the Minister of Education and the province have both told us you cannot do it. Okay, I think I'm going to just hand you the mic. I don't want to try to paraphrase if there's some depth of the question I might miss.
Thank you. So my first question is in regards to school buses. I have a sense, I may not be right, but I have a sense that on a lot of the school buses, there's a lot of empty seats. Is there any way of saving funds by using smaller vehicles, whether they're the smaller school buses that we sometimes see in cities, or whether they're more like the van style that I saw way driving and coming to the basketball game last week. It seems sensible that those would be more cost effective than these big school buses, but I don't know if that's true.
Jay, can you use this, the lapel mic? Which isn't there anymore for anyone who has a question. So the question about transportation and possible savings. I'll speak to the second one first. A small school bus has very little appreciable difference for operation costs to a big school bus. But the optics are different, right? So if you have 10 kids in a small school bus versus 10 kids in a long school bus, optically it looks a lot better in a small school bus. The vans is a non-starter, and it relates to a tragic accident with a basketball team in New Brunswick around 10 years ago approximately. We cannot use 15-passenger vans to transport students in Manitoba. We even looked into, one of the questions we asked in the last 3 weeks is, if we have kids that generally don't take the bus, for example, that high school kid that's 3 miles in and out for a pickup somewhere in our division, can we just phase them out and not pick them up? We could until they want to be picked up again. So there's no savings in that regard either. We even looked at possible models where, what if for those outlying kids we offered them compensation to transport themselves? But it comes down to a very simple principle. If they live within our school division, but outside of walking distance, the school division is obligated to provide transportation. We get funding for it. So that's essentially what it comes down to. Now, we even contemplated for vocational programs as a means of savings to run via private vehicles, but even that's complicated. Kids can drive themselves to high school, and that's their choice. But if we have kids from Rossburn and they're driving their own vehicle to come to Birtle, there's increased liability for school divisions, and that's why we provide buses. And they're the ones that, unfortunately, to this point, you may see riding down the highway with 4 or 5 students. So we have looked into, and we're open to any suggestions, but our Secretary, Treasurer, and our Transportation Director have helped us look into many possibilities in terms of reducing transportation costs. None of them are really viable or worthwhile to pursue. Anything else you want to say to that, Darrell, for transportation? You got a second question? In terms of purchase?
Yeah, your initial purchase maintenance is
Yep.
non-negotiable, right? It's going to cost same motor it's going to cost. But the initial purchase of the vehicle, smaller vehicle, just like saying buying a set of copper pack for $25,000 versus a luxury vehicle at $50,000.
Yeah, no.
There's an initial cost savings, wouldn't there be between the two vehicles?
So that's a fair comment. So just a comment about the difference in initial costs for small buses. I think some of our former trustees will know the answer to this as well as I will, because we talked about it on multiple occasions. It's not a huge price difference. Once you get the engine and the 4 wheels, the length doesn't add or reduce it by much, unfortunately. I mean, it might be $10,000 or $15,000, but we've also, there's lots of feedback from transportation supervisors around the province about reliability and dependability of the smaller buses, which is beyond my scope of understanding. And they're not ideal. But they're better for optics, obviously. And that's the challenge. Some of our bus routes have 40 kids on them, but on any given day, 17 kids are running on the bus. Because a lot of kids, once they get their license, they start driving. And the other challenge for our school division is the large number of daily kilometers that we travel. Because it's a big school division, and we have lots of areas where you can't just go from there to there in a straight line. Binscarth Valley, for example, it's quite challenging getting on either side of it. We have kids from far reaches that are on the bus a long time, but there's times where some of our buses are running for 25 minutes with 1 kid on it because of the first pickup. Sorry, Allison, go to the second question.
Yeah, that's fine. My second question relates to teacher salaries. You mentioned increments, and I don't know the details about that. I don't know what teachers make initially and what they make at the end of their career. But obviously they make more at the end than they do at the beginning. I asked at this meeting last year if there was any consideration given to offering teachers that are nearing retirement a package. I don't know if that would be cost effective or not. You'd have to do a lot of math on that. But to pay the teachers a little more right now to encourage them to retire, and then you could bring the cheaper teachers in to replace them. That's one aspect of this question. And similarly, when schools are facing a cut to a teaching position, they're going to be cutting their lowest seniority teacher, who is also their cheapest teacher, in favor of keeping the expensive teachers around. And I wonder if there's any mechanism for changing that and encouraging the teachers closer to retirement to go early and let the cheaper ones stick around. Having said that, of course, I'm in favor of experience and wisdom that comes with time, but I don't want to imply that we don't want to value people like that.
So I'll speak to the second one first. So there were a couple of instances in the last 3 years and potentially next year with some of the things we're proposing that some schools may have to move someone. But it's not a cut. It's a reduction in that school, but most of the people, all of the people that we're talking about that would be impacted by these budget reductions they still have permanent status in the school division. It just means that a term position somewhere else would be a position that we're not filling. So in this building, for example, the lowest seniority person potentially may have to move, but they have a permanent job and permanent status in our school division. To go back to the first question, we've explored on multiple occasions over the last 5 or 6 years, even before this financial challenge, the possibility of offering incentives. Southwest Horizon in some divisions for a period of time, 3-4 years, no one recently offered packages up to $12,000 to get people to retire early. All the divisions that we talked to that did that before said they didn't realize the savings that they anticipated, and it ended up not working anywhere near that they imagined. What I can tell you for this budget year, and much to the chagrin of our Secretary-Treasurer, myself and the Assistant Superintendent are making arguments on both sides about keeping programs and making reductions, and we had several discussions about potential savings for retiring people. This budget in our staffing plan has built-in potential savings, well, actual savings that we're going to realize from retiring teachers. We have up to 7 or 8, I think 8 is the number we're looking at, John? Yeah. And others that have told us they're retiring that just haven't given us the letter. Hopefully they don't change their mind, because we built in replacing those top-end salaries with, we had to pick a number, and we didn't say we're going to replace them all with first-year teachers, because if the principal at Rossburn Collegiate retires as he did, we're not replacing him with a new graduate. So we took an average. We said, what if we replace all 8 of those people, or 7 or 8 of those people, with a Class 5 teacher with 4 years of experience? So that helped us save quite a bit of money in our budget. So we have looked at that, Allison. It's just from what we've heard from other divisions, the ones that went really hard at it and offered packages, 5-digit packages, they didn't realize the savings, and almost to a division they recommended that they told us they discontinued for that reason, and they advised us not to consider it. Yep. You want to pass that mic forward for Janice? Okay.
I noticed that in the information that was sent out earlier, and earlier in your slide presentation, it said that the student support services was cut by $50,000 this year. Then why is it showing a 2% increase? Shouldn't that be a decrease if that funding's been cut?
Yeah, I can speak to that, Tanis. So the 46,000 you're seeing is the net effect of all the changes. The reason for the increase is more accurate costing in 2018-19. In previous years, I had costed resource and guidance teachers at the average teacher salary, and the actual cost of our resource and guidance teachers is usually at the top end. Does that make sense? Looks like you're still thinking about it, yeah. Feel free to ask another question.
Can I speak to that really quick, and maybe stay Darrell if it's another question with this. So the student services budget is being reduced by $50,000. What that may reflect is just things that would have been in other budgets or weren't accurately reflected in that budget are now being aligned properly. So
it's not really being cut, right? We are allocating more money in the budget to it, 2% more, to cover the real cost when we cost out those resource and guidance teachers at their actual cost instead of the average. So that's why it's going up. However, the net effect of losing the 5 hours in flex time plus 3 hours that are added due to increased enrollment, so there's really a net decrease of 2 hours per day, is what brought that number down to 2%. Yep.
Other questions? Thanks, Drill. And we would welcome comments or insight or even appeals for certain things. Since we sent this out on Tuesday, the one-page overview, and that was another intentional thing. We didn't want you to come tonight and be surprised by what we were proposing. So we wanted you to have an opportunity to think about what cutting the vocational programs meant and give you an opportunity if you wanted to raise a point tonight. I will say again, for anyone here or at home or who views this later, we'll schedule as much time we need for public presentations next week prior to a regular budget meeting. So you have a week to prepare. The only requirement, though, is that you contact the school division office, either myself or our administrative assistant, Jody Percival, to indicate that you want to make a presentation. And I would suggest that you do that by Tuesday of next week, ideally at the latest, and give us a sense of what you want to speak to. And so we'll know how many to schedule and how to do it. The nature of the budget last year, there was lots of interest in making public presentations. And you may recall that we started much earlier than 4:30. I think it was around 2:30 or 2 o'clock. And we had 10 or 11 presentations, many of them student-based. Any other questions? You're taking lots of notes. Rebecca, do you have any questions? You're going to come to present about Career Trek, or are there other things you're thinking about? All right. So I'm just asking a question of one of our students here that is visiting and taking lots of notes. Do you want to say that again just for the benefit of people that are listening?
I think I would present about the vocational programs being cut and what effects that might have on students, and some of the other cuts to staffing.
I'll do a final call for questions and comments, and if anyone is more comfortable just coming up and talking to us at the end of the recording, we'll stay as long as you have questions. You want to just 1 second, we'll get you a microphone. And you want to turn the camera as well, Jason, please? Go ahead.
I guess the question I have is more based upon the math. You're talking about possibly going to changing how it's set up or taught in terms, or going to an internet-based learning, so it's Skype or whatever. How will that affect the kids? You know, if you've got an A+ student, it's not really going to affect them because they're capable of learning that. But there's more than just that one style student that may need that course because they want to achieve more in life. And they need a personal one-on-one approach. How is that going to affect those kids?
So that's a good question. So if you have 6 or 7 courses from grade 10 to 12 and only 3 of them are delivered from your school, how does that affect kids if learning online is not the ideal medium for them? That's essentially what you're asking.
Yeah.
So what I can tell you, 2 things related to that. The new models of online learning are different than even what we're doing currently with IITV. Highly interactive. We're not going to dispute the fact that the best way for a student, a typical student, to learn is in a room with the teacher actually present. But we're going to be using things like tablets where the kids can write and the teachers can write. They can direct communication back and forth. So the teacher could be looking at Rebecca's screen as she writes and telling her, no, you got that one wrong. You got to check this one. Let's have another look at that. So we're going to use document cameras. The other thing that we're doing, and it's back to the point kind of I made earlier in a different context, Sometimes scarcity helps us be a little bit innovative. A lot of schools have told us that they have increased needs for guidance, and we're hearing that from many schools. We don't have the capacity to increase staffing in that area, but we're not reducing staffing for the high schools with this new math plan. So if currently you're delivering 6 math courses and next year your school is only delivering 2, you'll have that staffing that used to be assigned to those 4 classes that you save to use as you need it. So we're asking schools to look at students in the math classes to determine if those students are capable of working independently, in which case you can reassign the staff in your building, or if they need direct supervision and support. So it may be the case that the teacher from here is delivering applied math, or there may be 2 math classes happening online in a school, and there could be a math teacher available at that school to go back and forth to help kids as they're working. So we're trying to fill in the gaps that way. And we looked at other divisions, both in Manitoba and in Saskatchewan, what they do, and we're getting lots of advice. Sometimes it's librarians and EAs and people like that that get additional time to provide supervision, but it'll be school by school that will make that determination. So you may have 2 kids in grade 10 essential math that are highly capable, and they may just work independently. They could work in different parts of the building with a laptop and a headphone or headphone microphone set up. Or you may have 1 kid in a school working on grade 12 pre-calc that needs someone with them on a regular basis. And the schools will have staffing to be able to do that. But we're also trying to give them, it's not just about delivering it online. It's kind of like the optics of the school bus. We have some schools where grade 12 pre-calc has 4 students. And in the same building, grade 9 math has 25 students. That's a tough sell in a school, and it's not an equitable use of teacher resources. We're not discounting the importance of grade 12 math, but grade 9 math is important as well. So we are going to try to fill in those gaps, and there's lots of work to be done between now and September, for sure, and we're going to be closely monitoring how it goes next year in the pilot year. Any other questions or comments? Rebecca?
This is kind of going off the last question, but what if it's hands-on learning, such as kind of like how it's Woods classes? You can't really teach that online. So how would you do that? Since for those ones, you do actually have to be hands-on. And what if the student learns better hands-on or with a visual and not just online?
That's a good question. So we don't have a plan to replace all our courses with online learning. And we think math would be a good starting point just by the nature of instruction and the nature of student-teacher interaction. Certainly, we don't foresee moving to vocational programs online. However, I can tell you that there are school divisions that do that. I visited, I hate to say it, but I visited a school division in Newfoundland about 8 or 9 years ago to learn about their grade 6 outdoor ed program so we could develop one for ourselves that we no longer have. But I visited some online facilities, and one facility I visited was a teacher that had 10 kids in 8 different schools in Newfoundland and Labrador, some that were 5-hour flights away, and they were learning 3D fabrication. So he was watching them all. They all had their own equipment and machines. And as he's telling me about what's happening, he looked over and he shut some kid's machine off in Gander from his office in Corner Brook. So that stuff works, but it's not the best way for that to work. So I don't foresee us, there's not going to be, I hope there's not going to be online vocational or online, but some of the elements could be, right? I mean, something like healthcare aid, there's a lot of it that's content-based. If we were to look to different ways to deliver that, we might be able to do it that way. But yeah, the hands-on stuff would not work online. Other questions or comments? So I want to thank you, whether you came in person tonight or if you connected online, and just remind you that if anyone is interested in making a presentation, you'll have an opportunity to do it next Thursday. However, you need not wait till next Thursday to give feedback. If you think of something on the ride home, or if you have a question that you would rather not ask publicly or make a suggestion or recommendation to the board, everything we collect, I'm bringing back to the board. And I'll be, very bluntly, I'll say I'm not filtering any of that. There was someone that asked a lot of good questions last year on Twitter. They were called a BCI concerned parent, an anonymous person on Twitter. We responded to every question that we were able to respond to. And sometimes people would make statements that weren't questions, but we would treat them as questions just to give us an opportunity to respond to them. So if you have questions or comments, please send them to myself. Email the division email address that you can find on the web page. The board will have all of that to look at as soon as it's collected. The next time we get together as a group is next Thursday. So thanks so much for your time, and we're going to sign off in a minute online. And as I mentioned already, if anyone wants to linger, ask some questions, give us some things to think about in the next week, we'd welcome that. But thank you very much, and have a safe trip home.